So the other day, I was helping out some friends with a neat project they were working on, and we wound up with a couple of extra pieces of this really nice purple heart wood. They offered the little scrap pieces to me, and being the absolute material hoarder that I am, I immediately accepted. This left me with a problem though. What am I going to make with this? And after much deliberation, some soul searching, and 6 seconds of searching online, I thought, hey, why not make a pen? But that didn't feel like enough of a challenge, so I thought I would add the extra step of only using the mini-lathe to make this thing. Now, all that being said, I still haven't done any of the design work required to make this thing, so let's hop over to CAD and get things started. So I really didn't have too much of a plan going into this, but I decided I'd just sort of figure it out in the CAD as I was going along, which unfortunately means that the solid modeling in this assembly is a little bit rough. I find personally for me, doing this is a pretty good way to go about designing things, especially when I'm not sure completely what I want the final product to look like. Treat the CAD model as more of a 3D sketching tool, rather than a finalized design document. I know that I want to make the main body in 2 distinct parts, which I think is pretty standard for pens, and then have the parts screw together. And fortunately, I just got myself one of these. Oh no. While I was playing around with the base design, I was reminded of those super cool bolt-action pens you used to see around, and I decided that that was the actuation route that I was going to take. And after a bit more modeling and cleanup, here's the final design. All I need to do is slide the bolt forward, and then push it to this little notch on the left in order to lock it into place while you're writing. The main body of the pen, as I said before, is going to be turned out of 2 pieces of aluminum, and so the lower half is going to look like this, which interfaces with the upper half through a threaded connection here. The grip will be slid onto the lower half of the assembly, and that should be the main body of the pen done. As for the internals, we'll use a standard pen ink refill and a spring that I scavenged from a broken ballpoint pen, and assuming I'm not overlooking anything, from a design standpoint, I think we're good. But the only way to know for sure is to actually make it, and I recently picked up some new tooling that I think is going to make this go a whole lot easier. Aren't these the cutest little pieces of insert tooling you've ever seen? There is a slight problem though. These are 3/8 inch tools, and the tooling that I'm currently using on the lathe is 1/2 inch. And I don't have a quick change tool post that'll easily let me adjust the cutting height of the tool. So I'm going to need to make a couple little shims to go underneath this insert tool and bring the cutting height closer to the center. And I think I'm going to do that by making a shim out of this piece of aluminum. So I need about 100 thousandths of an inch of thickness, and this is 130 thousandths thick. So I think what I'm going to do is make a cut a section off, and then mill down the top surface on the CNC router until I have a 100 thousandth inch thick shim. And I know what you're going to say. You said that you're going to make this entire thing, without using the CNC router, but I think it's fine because I'm making a part for the tooling, not for the pen itself. So I think that leaves us in the clear, and let's go get this thing built. Okay, so I wasn't planning on talking anymore about these shims, but I am absolutely blown away with how well these things turned out, and isn't it just great when things actually work for a change? Alright, so step 1 is make the lower half of the pen assembly. And my plan is to turn the part down from this 1/2 inch piece of aluminum stock. This is too long to pass through the spindle bore where I have my lathe set up currently, so I first had to cut it down to size. Now that it's cut down to size, we are good to mount it in the chuck and get it ready for turning. Now, this piece of stock is sticking out way farther than the recommended 2 to 3 times the diameter of the part, so the first lathe operation we're going to need to do is drilling out the stock with a center drill to allow support from a live center. With the live center providing support, the first thing that we do is turn everything down to the highest diameter of the final part. Once the OD is cut down to size, we can come in and mark the length of the threaded section that we're going to need to turn down farther than the outermost edge of the part. Once the threaded section is done, we can go ahead and repeat basically the same process for the section that the wooden grip is going to need to slide over. Alright, now for the fun part. Let's haul out the live center and replace it with a Jacob's chuck that'll let us mount some drill tooling in the tailstock. So, because this is a pen, there needs to be a hollow that passes the entire way through the main body to provide space for the actual pen hardware itself, which means there is a lot of drilling in our near future. I'm going to go ahead and skip through most of it because it's pretty boring to watch, but the gist is plunge the bit into the material, let it do some cutting, pull the bit back out to clear the chips, add a little bit of oil occasionally, and rinse and repeat until you have the proper depth. There are markings on the tailstock that show how far you've extended the drill, but I don't find it particularly easy to read, so what I ended up doing was taking my calipers and measuring the depth of cut on the actual drill itself, and then taking a piece of electrical tape and using it to mark the depth on the drill, so that when it's mounted in the Jacob's chuck, it's easy to see when the tape lines up with the outer edge of the part, and when that happens, we know the hole is the proper depth. This strictly isn't the most accurate method of determining how deep a cut is going to be, but it works for this. We have pretty large tolerances on this part, so I'm not concerned, and I'm gonna keep using that, probably to make this entire thing. Now that the center is drilled out, we can flip this thing around and start machining the tapered section that leads to the point of the pen. One nice thing about the fact that the grip section is going to be covered by the purple heartwood is that we can clamp onto that section of the part and not worry about the chuck jaws causing damage to the surface finish. While I was cutting this down, I realized that I hadn't yet drilled the hole that will actually allow the tip of the pen to extend out of the housing. And so I opted to do that now before I finish turning down the taper, and that's just purely because I wanted the extra material to provide as much support as possible while we were performing this cut, as it is somewhat critical that it maintains at least close to the desired dimension to keep the end of the pen from wiggling around as you're writing with it. Now to finish up the taper, and I adjusted the angle a little bit here just because I felt it looked a little bit better like this. And now we can take this thing out of the lathe and cut some threads with one of those dies. And it was right about here that I realized that I had made a really dumb mistake. Alright, slight miscalculation with this part. I went full CAD goggles when designing it and did not allow for enough wall thickness to cut to the minor diameter of the thread that I want to put on this. So let's go ahead and fix that up, shall we? So now that our lower half is fixed to accept 3/8 inch threads rather than 5/16, we are good to go work on the upper half of the assembly. A lot of the techniques that are used to make the upper half of the assembly are pretty well the same as what was used to make the lower half, so let's just breeze through most of it that is the same and skip straight to the threading section. There isn't anything too wild about the technique I used to thread these here. I just took the tap and die set and used them to cut the inner and outer threads respectively. Now that the threads are cut, we can move on to the part that I think is actually a little bit more interesting, because the upper slot that is going to be used to hold the bolt for the bolt action mechanism is going to need to be a feature that is milled into the piece. And because, like I said before, we're not allowed to use the CNC router for this, we're going to need to find some setup on the lathe that'll let us do a basic milling operation. Doing this was actually a lot easier than I thought, and it effectively came down to filing down the extra material on the end of the upper body and mounting it in the tool post with shims. Once the setup was done, it was actually pretty easy to go and mill the feature into place by using a center drill to cut a hole in the side of the upper body, then swapping the center drill with an end mill and cutting the feature by advancing the cross slide. Alright, feature milled, and now we need to add the part that actually locks the bolt into place. And the best way I could think to do that was just take a couple of these small files that I have and just spend a huge amount of time filing this feature into place. It took a while to do, but I think the end result is actually pretty good, all things considered. Okay, so now we're on to the part that arguably has the most critical dimensions of everything we've made so far. This is the part that allows the bolt you can access from the outside of the pen to interface with the pen refill, and it's quite important that this is the correct diameter and length to both allow it to slide freely in the upper housing, and also push the pen refill far enough to allow the pen to extend out for writing. To make the part, we use a lot of the same techniques that we used before, where we just use the lathe tooling to turn the part down to the right dimensions. And then for the feature that needs to be drilled, again keeping in spirit with the only using the mini-lathe to make this part, I parted the piece off and created a small shim just out of a piece of round stock that I had that holds the component at the right height to allow our center drill to drill the feature that will receive the bolt. So speaking of bolt, I'd originally meant to turn a small aluminum dowel for the grip that allows you to extend the pen. But I had an idea after cutting the slot to use a literal stainless steel bolt and let it cut itself into the aluminum. To use it though, I had to cut down the midsection so it would be small enough to fit in the slot, which means that I get to try to cut stainless steel for the first time on this thing. I took really light cuts and honestly, it worked a lot better than I'd expected. I had no problems at all and it turned out perfect. So we've gotten to the point where we need to make the grip, and I've come across a slight problem. This is a square and I only have a 3-jaw chuck. So I think the solution is going to be grab the 3D printer and make a kind of half nut collet that can fit around this and be used to clamp this in the lathe. And again, I don't think it's cheating to use a 3D printer for this because technically I'm making a tool that'll let me make the pen, not a part for the pen. So I think that still leaves us in the clear. I quickly put together a model of the split nut style fixture based on the dimensions of the wooden block and then 3D printed it. I had no idea if it was going to work or not, but it seemed to do the job pretty well. It didn't slip in the chuck and it held the wood fairly centered. After I got the wood roughly cut to shape and drilled out, I came in with some 320 grit emery cloth and used it to round the grip out and give it a bit of a more smoother contoured shape. One thing you may notice is that the Purple Heart wood is not very purple in any of these clips, and that is because the wood only turns purple as it's oxidized and exposed to UV light. I wanted the grip to be a pretty deep purple color, so I set up this little jig with a UV light to help speed things along. While we're waiting for that, I went ahead and removed the supporting material from the upper housing and added a small chamfer to the end. Coming back to the grip, now that it's had time to set and turn a nice shade of purple, we're going to apply a coat of lacquer to it and finally get the pen assembled. Lacquer applied, and I'm very happy with how this thing turned out. It really brought out the color of the wood, and I'm a big fan of the shine it adds. Now, time for the final assembly of all the components. And there we go, looking quite good if I do say so myself. And it even writes well. Hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.